This is where we left off last time. We were talking just initially about Aristotle's views on slavery. And, you know, his teacher Plato pretty much rejected slavery. He didn't deal with slavery systematically in the way that Aristotle does. But because he so condemned imperialism, you know, conquest, just sort of taking things, you know, you can surmise that Plato's views of slavery were pretty dim because, you know, most slaves that the Greeks had would have been taken through conquest. Many of them were maybe highly educated people, skilled people, people who would in their normal lives be doing things, being quite successful. They might have been people who the last thing that they would ever want to do is be somebody's servant. Now, Aristotle does deal with the issue systematically, and I think last time I suggested that we needed to talk about, in his distinction between the natural and the conventional slave, when he describes the natural slave, can we figure out whether he's got a prejudice of sorts? In other words, who is he talking about when he refers to the natural slave? Okay? And I believe that we had looked at this quote here on page 6, where Aristotle talks about how we wouldn't need slaves if it weren't for the fact that machines and things can't work on their own, that, you know, physical labor is needed, which seemed to imply that the main reason for slavery was just the desire to have free labor. But then he goes on to make this distinction between the natural and the unnatural slaves. And his description of natural slave is somebody who cannot really order his or her own actions, but can take orders. Okay? So that would seem to imply that anybody with you know, volition and judgment, anybody who can make a decision, would not be a natural slave, and that the people who would be so-called natural slaves would be people who could not live on their own. But then there's still the question of, what does he think that constitutes? Okay, what is the kind of person who supposedly can't, you know, do anything but take orders? He does say on page 11 that those who are taken in warfare, the most common source of slavery, are most often not natural slaves. So that's kind of interesting. On page 11, under 1255, he says, "It's clear then that the objection with which we began has something to be said for it, and that the one lot, the one type, are not always natural slaves, nor the other naturally free. But it is also clear that in some cases there is such a distinction, cases where it is beneficial and just for one to be master and the other to be slave, and where the one ought to be ruled and the other ought to exercise the rule that is natural to him." And down at the bottom he says, "Hence, there is a certain mutual benefit and mutual friendship for such masters and slaves as deserve to be by nature so related. When their relationship is not that way, however, but is based on law, and they have been subjected to force, the opposite holds." Okay? So that's kind of interesting because, you know, the existing institution of slavery was by law and was based on force. In other words, you didn't find too many people voluntarily sticking around. They were captured, you know, and they were forced into slavery. And the Athenian law upheld that institution and enforced it. Okay? So it's kind of curious that in a way we see Aristotle agreeing with his teacher here, in that it seems like he's saying existing slavery, or much of it, is unjust because it's based on force and law and not voluntary agreement. Okay? And somehow also it's interesting that he conceives of a type of relationship where there's mutual benefit and even, he says, mutual friendship between natural people who are naturally suited for these two things. So it leads people to wonder, what is Aristotle talking about here? What kind of relationship and what kind of people are involved in this so-called natural slavery? Now, I say this here because regardless of how we answer that question, we do see here the beginnings of a natural law theory, in that he's applying the concept of nature to judge whether a certain institution is wrong or right, you know. So he's got some sort of standard of what is natural, and if the practice doesn't match up with what he conceives of as natural, then it is unnatural. It is simply conventional, and it can be unjust, okay? So regardless of what else we take away from this part of Aristotle's teaching, you can see the natural law idea coming out here. And natural law was developed further during the medieval period in Europe, as we'll see, using Aristotle's concepts of natural and unnatural. Okay, so Arnhart has some commentary on this issue. He says that it's true that most scholars have seen, and actually in the past saw, Aristotle's teachings as justifying the institution of slavery. Okay? And Aristotle has been strongly critiqued in modern times as a source of the justification for slavery. Okay? But Arnhart points out that because of the ambiguity in the way that Aristotle discusses slavery, his arguments have been used, both pro and con, as either a support for or as an argument against existing practice of slavery. And he mentions the case of Latin America here that I alluded to last time. So Arnhart says, in the subsequent history of the debate over the nature of slaves and women, the ambiguity of Aristotle's remarks becomes evident. In the 16th century, when the Spanish invaded the New World, some of the scholarly advisors to the Spanish leaders argued that the Native American Indians were natural slaves, as defined by Aristotle. Okay, can you see how some people could make that argument back then? Well, they don't, they don't have education, and they don't know what we know, and they seem to be, from these people's perspectives, to be primitive and therefore natural slaves according to Aristotle. Yet other scholars like Francisco Vittoria and Bartolomé de las Casas could argue that by Aristotle's standards, the only natural slaves, if they existed, would be freaks of nature who lacked the mental capacity of normal adults. And since such deviations from nature's normal pattern must be rare, it would be impossible for an entire race or society of human beings to be natural slaves. Okay, can you see how a person could come up with that, too? Similarly, at about the same time in France and Italy, when scholars debated whether men and women were morally and intellectually equal, Aristotle was cited on both sides of the argument. So, and we'll look at the issue of women in a little bit, but I'm sure you noticed as you read this that it was a little confusing, because Aristotle just doesn't say, women are basically so inferior to men that they should obey. He's already basically said women are not of a slavish character, and he goes on to speak of women in ways that make you wonder exactly what it is. How is he thinking? Okay. So isn't that interesting that Aristotle's arguments could be used both, and were used both, to justify the enslavement and mistreatment of the Indians, and also to criticize it? Can you see both? Okay. I'm not really thinking that we can resolve this one, all right, because we can't go back and ask Aristotle, what exactly did you mean by this? But at the very least, we can see he himself says, slaves taken in war and slavery enforced by law is not just, or it's not what's natural. Okay. So, though ambiguous, I don't see how Aristotle's comments could support a lot of conventional slavery if you really read it. If you read it well, you know, and you ask yourself, well, who fits that category and who doesn't fit that category? So it's kind of interesting. All right. So Arnhart concludes that the natural slave can't be people who are conquered just because they're conquered, because there are many people who are conquered who won't fit the description of Aristotle's natural slave. And we know it can't be based on broad categories like race or particular culture, because people vary so much within these categories that, again, you can find people who are well educated. Certainly amongst the Indians that the Spaniards conquered, weren't there plenty of educated people? Actually, there were mathematicians. I mean, these people had come up with quite a bit of knowledge, actually, astronomy and so forth, architecture, right? Which the Spaniards could see with their own eyes. They could see that these were thinking people. Yes, they did have some barbaric practices too, but they could see these were thinking people. So they wrote, they had a language. All right, so before we move on to this issue, I just wanted to ask you what you thought about Aristotle's teaching. Does Aristotle cause more problems just because he's ambiguous? I mean, would you have liked him to be more clear on this issue of slavery?
I think he would have liked to have been more clear, or if he would have seen like what his wishy-washiness, like what it had done with people, you know, taking both sides of the argument. Mm-hmm. I think as an intellectual, Plato would have rather have had, you know, people using what he intended mm-hmm. for their purposes.
Mm-hmm. Rather than allowing so much interpretation. Yeah. And part of the problem probably is that this is not a book that's just written by him as a book where he could have gone through all of it and clarified and so forth. Lecture notes is what this is, and probably not ultimately edited and compiled by him. So that's probably part of the problem. And I think it's a neat question to ask if he could look back, you know, from this vantage point and see how his arguments could be taken in two completely different directions. How disappointed he would probably be, you know, because when you teach, you don't want, this is the last thing you want people to do. And yes, I think it would probably be frustrating. Yeah, did you have something else?
Oh, no, I didn't.
Okay. Anybody else? Well, you know, these ancient texts, they've carried so much weight and authority over the centuries. And so with any text, you know, there's always room for interpretation, but some are more interpretable than others. Some are more, in other words, more ambiguous than others. And the lengthier they are, the more room there is, it seems like, for people to find some sort of way of seeing their own point of view in them. So it becomes even more important to kind of step back from, I guess, from your own modern assumptions as well as your own prejudices and take a good hard look at what the person really says. And that's one thing we try to do in these classes. On the issue of property, Aristotle definitely disagrees. As I mentioned in the summary at the beginning of this unit, he definitely disagrees with Plato's view on communism. Can anybody kind of summarize why Plato preferred communism in the leadership class of the Republic? What was the main reason, do you think?
It was to primarily make it so that everybody was loyal to the state and not their own self-interest.
Mm-hmm. Right. It had to do with unity, with making sure that the leaders thought of nothing but the common good. And to that end, Plato proposed not just what we think of as communism, which is no private property, but beyond that, communism of people as well. So there were no families, no permanent families. There was no, these are my children. Okay, so it was very, very extreme communism. And Aristotle really, really disagrees with that. he mentions the Republic by name, so this is one of those cases where Aristotle takes on the teacher directly. And I will just caution, okay, now when we read the Republic, we read it as not necessarily just proposing literally that there ought to be communism in the leadership class. We talked about the metaphorical meaning of it, right? So it could be that Aristotle is not correct in his interpretation because the Republic is also very interpretable, okay? The way he takes it is as a proposal for communism.
Or maybe that like gives us a hint to what Plato was writing about, because it wasn't Plato's teacher. I mean, maybe he knew more than we do about.
I think that's a very strong argument, yeah, and one that keeps popping up in my mind whenever I deal with this topic is, you know, Aristotle knew Plato very well and knew his intentions, right? And so you would think he would know if Plato really admired communism. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't other things also going on in the book, but yeah, I mean, perhaps this means that Plato did think, at least ideally, it would be better for people to not have these individual attachments, okay? That they get in the way. They get in the way of our ability to think about other people and the common good. So I think that's an excellent point. So here's what Aristotle says, disagreeing with this. He's disagreeing with Plato's focus on, the evilness of property and individual attachments. Up at the top of page 27, he says, besides, the end he, Plato, says his city-state should have is impossible, as in fact described. Yet nothing has been settled about how one ought to delimit it. I'm talking about the assumption that it is best for a city-state to be as far as possible all one unit, for that is the assumption Socrates adopts. And yet it is evident that the more of a unity a city-state becomes, the less of a city-state it will be. Isn't that interesting? The more of a unity the city-state becomes, the less of a city-state it will be. So it becomes something else, not a city-state or not a state, which implies, for Aristotle, political activity. Okay? He says, for a city-state naturally consists of a certain multitude, and as it becomes more of a unity, it will turn from a city-state into a household, and from a household into a human being. Okay, what's he talking about there? Obviously not literally, okay, but what does he mean? The more unity, we go from multitude to household, from household to human being.
The individual, focusing on the person, like the person makes the state.
Well, he thinks that the collection of individuals is the multitude. And you're right that for him, this collection of individuals and the fact that they're individuals, that's what makes the city-state.
It sounds like what he was talking about at the very beginning about, like he just blatantly said that the city-state is not like the house, right? Household, didn't say that.
Right.
I don't know exactly why he doesn't want that, but he's saying like it's not the same. I think it's not good that the city-state would be the house or an individual.
Yeah. We go from the individuals coming together to form a family, and then from the family to the village, and then from the village to the larger community, and then finally the city-state. So, he's defined in his own terms what the city-state consists of. Okay? And it is a multiplicity of individuals that make up smaller communities, and they all come together, right? And they remain citizens, and we know that political participation is a good in and of itself for Aristotle, okay? But in Plato's Republic, how many people participate? Just a tiny few, right? And this discussion reminds me of Hobbes's Leviathan, which we're not going to study in this class, but Hobbes, this 17th century thinker, from England, he had this idea of the best type of city being, or the best type of country being a monarchy, where one ruled and made the decisions for all, okay? And that he called the people citizens, but in fact they weren't citizens in any sense of actually participating in any meaningful way. The monarch, the sovereign, made all the decisions. And on the front of the book, when it was originally published, there was this sketch, this probably a woodcut, but there was this picture of the king with his crown on and all of his regalia. And then if you looked close, you could see all the people were inside of his body, okay? There's people all over the king, okay? Meaning that he makes up them all, he represents them all. His decisions are their decisions, okay? And ideally, something like that is what Plato seems to want, as long as the king or kings are wise, okay? But Aristotle, seeking for the good life for people, doesn't think that people will be fulfilled if all they do is obey.
Can you explain to Aristotle's thoughts on slavery? Because to him, the difference between is like people who can actually make decisions and people who can't. And so he's looking at this maybe as that communism's not going to work because you can't just have a bunch of people just have one person making all the decisions, because those people aren't the actual slaves. They may have, and they have the right to make decisions for themselves. So I feel personally maybe that's one of the reasons why Aristotle is not looking at Plato's view as his own, because he's just in his mind believes that people have that natural right to decide how they're going to live.
Yeah, I think they do go together, right? Because you know, in his view, probably the Republic treats most people like slaves, but in his view, they're not. You know, most people have the ability to make decisions. They have some judgment, and that judgment can be cultivated and can be made better if they're put into the right environment and have the opportunities to do so. So the type of city that Plato recommends is unnatural in Aristotle's view, because it treats many people as though they have no judgment, no ability to make decisions on their own. And so, you know, the old question that was raised to Socrates, well, why would anybody want to live in this city, is the question that, you know, that Aristotle asks. You know, if the city is for the people, then it has to give them the ability to become the best they can be. Okay? So I think you're right. You're absolutely right on there. And so when he says that, you know, if we get too much unity, the city-state becomes a human being, it means that it becomes so much of a unity that the individuals are no longer really, they don't really exist. They're absorbed into it, okay? And it doesn't act like it has any sort of political or social significance for people, okay? It also comes back just to his view that human beings are political animals, right? So if people are political animals and they don't get a chance to fulfill their political nature, they can't be fully human. Okay? So, you know, he makes many arguments against communism. That's one of them, and probably the best one. He also argues that our natural ties to each other, to ourselves and to each other, are so strong that they can't be ignored. That this is a part of the human experience that we just can't get rid of by any means of indoctrination or anything like that. So it starts with our own physical experience, okay? We remain individuals because we cannot feel other people's pain the way that we feel our own, literally. So our body is always reminding us that we're individuals with our own needs, with our own interests and so forth. And furthermore, those whom we are closest to, particularly those who are our genetic material, so to speak, are naturally going to be more ours than anybody else. Okay? And this is so instinctual that it can't be overcome. And Aristotle doesn't think we should try to overcome it. That is, he doesn't see a problem with us saying, My children are very important to me. I make my decisions on the basis of their well-being, okay? Because if we put our children into the hands of the state to be raised, okay, do you think they'll be raised as well with as much care as if we raised them in our own homes? I mean, I realize that some people are defective and they don't raise their children well, but for the most part, okay, if people have this bond, you know, that they have this supreme interest in their children that other people can't. You know, that's why there's often a clash between the parents and other caregivers or schools and so forth. Yeah.
I mean, you can look at like the foster care system as an example, because that's kind of like the state like raising children, and just how it's so much different. Like if someone who is out of foster care and someone actually lives in a stable home, there's just much a difference in how far that person who's in a stable home with like parents succeeds versus the person who has to be raised by the state as their lives. Like it's an incredible difference. So we really can be like look back, we look at our own examples, and it's just better to be in a home where people love you specifically instead of like just one of like thousands of other children. So.
Right, yeah. And orphanages are even worse. You know, kids who are raised in orphanages are more likely to have mental health issues. And kids raised in the foster system are more likely to have behavioral problems and to be less successful in life. So there's something about this natural bond that makes people feel more supported, that makes people feel supremely interested. And it's basically, you could look at it as selfishness, okay? This is mine, special, you know, for no particular reason, but this is not the way Aristotle looks at it. He doesn't look at it as selfishness, he looks at it as a natural instinct which serves a purpose. And that purpose is, you know, to raise these children well so that they can go on and do the same. And he doesn't see this as interfering with the common good, because he thinks that we link our interest to the common good through such things as the property that we own and the children that we have. Okay? If I'm interested in, for instance, what the school board is doing, what the USD 383 is doing, it's because I have a son in the school system. So whereas if I didn't have a son in the school system, I probably would ignore the school news. Okay, I'm being honest, you know. But because I do, I try to keep track of what it is they're doing, and if something really egregious happened, although I'm a little cynical about my ability to actually change anything, but if something egregious happened, I'd probably be down there, you know, with other parents complaining about it. One of the things that I found out recently was they don't have any sort of system like we do, like K-State Online. Teachers in our very well-to-do school system don't have the ability to post their assignments online, and students don't have access to them that way. That actually made me ticked off a little bit, and I'm actually thinking about, you know, writing some letters, because I think it's absolutely essential at this point in time. And the teachers that I talked to said, we don't think it's ever going to happen. They're not going to pay for that. So do they pay for toilet paper in your bathrooms, or do you have to supply that too? So, you know, why am I interested? Because my kid will get a better education if they have that tool. And why am I interested in what the city commission does? Because I own property in the city and I pay property taxes, and I want to know the property taxes are paying for something worthwhile, not something and not wasting my money and so forth. So I keep track of what the city commission does, and I think about who I should vote for and so forth. Okay? If I didn't have property, I might not care so much. Okay? So this is Aristotle's point, is that these things that Plato thought would make us selfish and not care about the community, these are the very things that make us care about the community. And so rather than fighting against them constantly, we need to work with them. We need to make sure that people do make that connection between what is their own and the larger community, okay? If your family is living in a community that's lawless, where there's a lot of crime, or where the education is no good, okay, or where your tax dollars are spent on the wrong kind of things, your family's going to be much worse off. Their future is going to be impacted by that. So you are going to see the connection. Okay? And on the other hand, Aristotle points out that if we have common property, the things that we hold in common tend to get abused. Okay? They get neglected because people say, well, it's somebody else's job. Maybe it's the government worker's job to take care of this community space, but it's not my job. And, you know, if I'm going to litter, if I'm going to mess something up, I am more likely to do it on common property than on something that I consider to be my own. Right? And this reminds me of back in the 70s when we were trying to come up with a way to deal with poverty and to move people from poverty into the mainstream and into jobs. One of the things that they did was they created these big high-rise projects. In my community, they were called turnkey projects. And Illinois was full of them, and we had our share of really, big buildings, maybe 5 to 10 stories high, and they had, uniform apartments. They were built to be very efficient in the use of space, and they were really, really depressing, to look at and I'm sure to live in too. And they became just run down really fast. Within 10 years or so, and the police would not even go into these places. So everybody left them alone for the most part because they became dangerous, they became crime-ridden, and pretty soon they were shot. Okay? Why? Because people living in them, it wasn't their property, they had no particular stake, in the community. They also felt like they were being put into something that treated them far differently than other people. Okay? Other people get to live in houses or in apartments that look halfway decent and have some individuality. They were being thrown into more or less cinder block, apartments. So when you get put into a situation like that, you don't care very much about that. It's not yours. You're not even sure that you're grateful for it. Okay? So, it became trashed, and eventually those were shut down and replaced with more interspersed community housing, in smaller sections interspersed throughout the community, which seemed to work better. So there's that problem too, which is kind of interesting that Aristotle could see, maybe we've gotten past this to a certain extent, but it certainly used to be the case that public parks were mistreated by people. I think maybe people have gotten a little bit more sensitive now, but then again, maybe not. Has anybody been to the Country Stampede recently? Okay. I haven't been to the Country Stampede, but I've seen kind of the aftermath of the Country Stampede because my club, one of the things that they do is they'll make a little extra money by helping with cleanup. And it's like muddy, crud everywhere, trash everywhere. It takes quite a while for the park to recover from all the damage that's done at the Country Stampede. But it's public property, and you would never dream of doing that to your own property, but you can walk away from it. All right, then there's this other issue that Aristotle brings up about property and having property yourself, and that is that of benevolence or charity, as we call it, okay? Now, Plato would have thought that communism, in a way, is the most charitable system of all, because everybody has the same resources. Nobody has more or less, okay? And there seems to be some sort of rightness about that. Okay? However, Aristotle says people should be charitable. The system, in Plato's system, the system might be charitable in the sense that it distributes things equally. But what about the people in it? Okay? it doesn't necessarily produce a charitable impulse, but rather it can produce a sort of selfish impulse. Let me grab what's mine from the common store before somebody else does. But as far as bringing out the charitable impulse in people, you do that by them having something to give, okay? Does that make sense? So if you don't have anything to give, okay, then you have no ability to practice charity. Now, does it matter very much how much you have to give as far as this, you know, building up this sense of charity? Not really. I mean, if you're poor and you give $1 or $2 at the store when you buy your groceries, that's a charitable act. It's a character building act. Okay? If you're wealthy and you give $10,000, it kind of produces the same result for you. Okay? It's not a matter of how much as it is the act itself. Aristotle says on 33 in the middle, the love each person feels for himself is no accident, but is something natural. Okay? Selfishness is rightly criticized. But it is not just loving oneself, it is loving oneself more than one should, just as in the case of the love of money, since practically everyone does love each of these things. Moreover, it's very pleasant to help one's friends, guests, or companions and do them favors, as one can if one has property of one's own. But those who make the city-state too much of a unity by abolishing private property exclude these pleasures. They also openly take away the tasks of the two of the virtues, of temperance in regard to women, for it is a fine thing to stay away from another man's woman out of temperance, and generosity for one's property, since one cannot show oneself to be generous, nor perform any generous action, for it is in the use made of property that generosity's task lies. Okay. You may have found it odd that he mentioned women there, but the reason why is because Plato's proposals in, you know, the top 2 classes of the Republic say there's no permanent marriages, okay? So in order for you to have temperance and generosity regarding relationships with others, there have to be those permanent relationships, you know, of marriage, you know, of 2 people saying we're going to stay together for life. Then it's possible for you to either practice self-control or not, okay? And the virtue of self-control and basically respecting what is another's, in this case another person's wife, is not possible if there's no marriage, if there's no permanent mind, okay? In the same way, you know, there's no ability to have pleasure in helping others without having some resources. Now, Aristotle does say, I will say this, you know, what I expressed earlier is more of a modern view of charity in a way. Aristotle does acknowledge that any amount of generosity is good for the person, but he does say that the happiest person is that person who has acquired enough to be able to be very generous, okay? But generosity is only so if it's voluntary, if it's not forced on you by the government, okay? So, does that make sense? Okay. So, I mean, you even hear this argument today amongst people when they start to argue about how much of a role the government ought to have in taking care of people, the welfare state. And one of the arguments that you hear is every step that the government takes in the direction of expanding the welfare state takes away from people the opportunity for charity and generosity. Why? Because you can say to yourself, I pay a lot of taxes and they pay for all of these things, you know. I'm probably going to pay, just in federal income taxes alone, about $14,000. And, you know, sometimes it kind of occurs to me, but I battle against this tendency, but it kind of, you kind of wonder, you know, how much more should I give, right? It's just a sort of, you know, so this is the kind of comment that you sometimes get when people are thinking about this in a less selfish way. I mean, the selfish side comes out when you say, I just don't want to give any more to anybody, okay? But the other part of this is, well, if government is taking care of everybody, which they're not actually adequately, then I don't really have a responsibility, anymore. My responsibility is taken care of by my taxes. But actually, when you look at the world, you realize, no, there's a lot of need left, which is really kind of shocking, given how much people do pay in taxes. But I figured out a long time ago when I was in my 20s that just because you pay a lot in taxes doesn't mean the government does the right things with it, right? I mean, it does a lot of stuff with it, but somehow we still have poor people in our midst, which came as quite a shock to me when I started to pay taxes. All right, so you will all be hopefully in that situation soon, and you will see what I mean. If you get a salaried job, with benefits, about 45% of your income will be gone before you get your paycheck. You get your federal taxes, your state taxes, your Social Security, your Medicaid, and the benefits and your retirement stuff all comes out of your check. And suddenly it's like 40 to 45% less. It's interesting. So then you ask yourself, what's being done with my money? See, which is why there's this connection. Now I'm interested in government. I want to know what's being done with that. All right. And by the way, my first job, I was making $27,000 a year. I thought back in 1990 that was okay. But after taxes and stuff, I couldn't even afford furniture for my apartment. It was like, wow, okay, now I better start thinking. Okay, now we also have this issue of women. We can get into this a little bit, but we'll have to come back to it. Just to remind you of what we know so far about what Aristotle says, he distinguishes between women and natural slaves. We saw that already. He says women are not by nature slavish. Okay. He's also said on page 8, the relationship of male to female is one of natural superior to natural inferior. So even though women are not slavish, men are superior to women in his view in some way. Okay? He says that one rules, the male rules, and the other is ruled. Okay? But not in the same way that the natural master and the natural slave, one rules and the other is ruled. And I think I already mentioned that perhaps part of the reason why Aristotle develops the view that he does on women is not just because of his observations of women and men in his society, but his observations about the animal kingdom. He no doubt noticed in his zoological research that males tend to be more aggressive, they tend to be more dominant in a lot of species, probably most that he would have observed. Okay. So that might have had something to do with his view too. Now, next he argues that women should come under what he calls constitutional rule in the household. Okay? So the way that the husband rules over his wife is with constitutional rule. Okay? So we have to ask, well, what does that mean? It's not the same rule as master over slave. Yet women in the household, in Aristotle's view, would not have an equal voice. They wouldn't be able to veto their husband. Okay. What do you suppose, just off the bat, he means by constitutional rule?
Highly restricted rule
Okay.
as to their authority.
Okay, so there'd be rules about where their domain was and where it wasn't and so forth. That's probably part of it. You know. This relationship has structure because in Aristotle's view, people fill different roles. Males fill one role, women fill another role, and the relationship works when they sort of do their roles, but don't interfere with each other. Okay? So that's part of it. Some people have wondered whether Aristotle's talking about basically the husband representing the household, but still with the awareness that his wife has a voice. Okay. Again, this is one of these areas where it's kind of hard to tell what he exactly is saying. Okay.
It's more like I see this a lot today in some families where, you know, the husband's not like just completely controlling what his wife does, but I don't know, say they have a child and the child like, you know, asks the mom if it's okay if he does something, mom says yes, but when he has his dad says no, because the dad said no, that it's a complete no regardless of what the mom said. And so it's like the dad just has the last word, and at the end of the day, if he says no, then it's a no regardless.
Something like that, yeah, but not the dictatorial dad. In other words, if that interpretation is correct, the father would take into account the views of the wife, but ultimately if they disagreed, and Aristotle does say this, if they disagree, somebody has to decide, and it will be the male. So that's, you know, but in the meantime, and this was the justification for not allowing women to vote, for instance, for a long time. It was the idea that the husband represented the needs and wishes of the family, and he could be counted on, which is, you know, which was sometimes true, but not. It depends on the person. Counted upon to take into account the needs, wishes, and views of his wife, okay, but then represent the family with the superior judgment. Unfortunately, the problem is it all depends on the quality of the person, right? And many husbands did not have the same judgment as their wives, or have less judgment, but which is why it's probably not good to rely on a system like that. But something like that is probably what Aristotle's talking about. In other words, the husband doesn't rule his wife like a slave and not take into account her views, her wishes, her needs, and so forth. The rule is more like a benevolent monarch, okay? But of course, that's an ideal, and it's not always a reality. Now, as far as bringing them under the constitution of the state, that is, viewing them more as citizens, okay? Aristotle seems to be in favor not of letting them rule in the state, but of considering them as citizens within the state with needs, with a role, with a function too. And the way we glean this is from Aristotle's discussion of Sparta and the way that their women were completely private, okay? Apparently, if women are completely private and are not considered citizens, and their way of life is not taken into account in the city, they can become a very negative force in his view. So